Thanks very much. God bless you. Thanks. Well, thank you, kind sir, for that. Thanks, everybody. I can't see you now with the lights in my eyes, but what a magnificent room just to come in this place tonight and see this crowd. What a tribute to Father Sirico and to the Acton Institute, which I think has made a massive contribution to both church and society. So I want to pay tribute to Father Sirico, but to the board of directors too. Just marvelous, and a much needed conversation between the classical religious tradition and the economic and political traditions, a conversation that often, as you know, doesn't happen creatively. So thank you for the invitation. Father has invited me before, but it was more difficult when I was in California. Now in Minnesota, it's a little easier flight over here to Grand Rapids. Listen, I want to talk to you tonight about wokeism, not because I like it, but because I hate it. And I think it's having a massively deleterious effect on our culture. It's found its way into almost every nook and cranny of our civilization now. One of our major political parties is largely organized now, it seems to me, to support wokeism. But I think it's very important, everybody, if we stand against it as I do, that we do so in a sophisticated way. And to recognize that wokeism is not a ephemeral phenomenon that came out of the summer of 2020. Wokeism has a long and easily recognizable, it seems to me, intellectual pedigree. And the more clearly we grasp that, the more creatively we'll be able to engage it. I'm going to begin not so much with a definition, but a description. Wokeism, I would say, is a popularization of critical theory. It's a popularization of critical theory having made its way now out into the streets. What's critical theory? Well, it's a movement that obtained largely in the French and German academies in the middle of the 20th century. Think of people such as Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, maybe the major names. But critical theory found its way in the late 60s and 70s into the American Academy. I just finished a biography of René Girard, and Girard himself, though I think would be an opponent of wokeism, but he was involved in organizing a conference at Johns Hopkins in the late 60s, where Derrida came over for the first time to these shores. And he said it was the moment when French structuralism and postmodernism made its way into the American Academy. Well, there it gestated, it seems to me, for several decades, and then broke out as a kind of bacillus into the wider bloodstream of the society, indeed in that summer of 2020. So what I'm going to try to do tonight, in just very brief compass, is lay out some of the features of critical theory, which has now expressed itself as wokeism, and then just to suggest how Catholic social theory stands dramatically athwart the assumptions behind wokeism. Okay, so here's the first quality, I think, of critical theory. What I will call a radicalization of the modern sense of the self. A radicalization of the modern sense of the self. Now, as you know, the two probably major figures in the emergence of typically modern philosophy would be René Descartes and Immanuel Kant. I've told my students over the years, if you want to see the place where modernity was born, you can find it. It's in the German city of Ulm. Because Descartes was wandering around with the French army and he slipped off. He was searching for the foundations of philosophy. And he said he retreated to a heated room in the city of Ulm. And there he came up with the famous cogito ergo sum, right? I can doubt everything. I can doubt the received tradition. I can doubt religion. I can doubt even sense experience. But the one thing I can't possibly doubt is that I'm doubting. Hence, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Now, notice the move, though, that Descartes makes here, is he compels the objective to come before the bar of the subjective for adjudication. Because now the cogito reigns supreme as the arbiter of truth. Also on this basis, he distinguishes between what he calls res extense, extended things out there, and then res cogitantes, thinking things in here. The radical division between body and soul is bequeathed to modernity as a typical anthropology. Now, the second figure, Immanuel Kant, you see it famously in his critique of pure reason when the classical metaphysical categories of time and space and identity and substance are not out there in the world. They're already in here as a priori structures of the mind, right? So we project these realities onto the world. Same thing in Kant's moral theory. Remember, he says the only thing that can be called good without qualification is a good will. That means I'm not looking to my acts in the world to determine what's right or wrong. I'm looking at the quality of the will that chooses. The move, again, privileging the interior over the exterior. I think you could argue, read Cyril O'Regan on this point, that Descartes and Kant do represent a recovery of ancient Gnosticism, which in a very similar way privileged the sort of inside over the outside, tended to see the body as something dangerous and problematic and the real self inside. Now, critical theory, I would argue, radicalizes this modern sense of the self. So that the interior, the real me in here, is dramatically privileged over what's out there, over the exteriority of the body. If you don't see this influence in present-day gender theory, you're not paying attention. I mean, what do we hear all the time? And it's extraordinary to me how taken for granted it is, though it's a terribly erroneous anthropology. But it's taken for granted. Well, I mean, deep down inside, this is who I am. It just doesn't correspond to my body, so I have to change my body accordingly. That's a radicalized modern self, the privileging of the interior over the exterior. Just by way of contrast, consider this little line from St. Thomas Aquinas, my intellectual hero. Aquinas says, "The soul is in the body, yes, but not as contained by it, but rather as containing it." Let me say that again, because I think there's a whole revolution in consciousness there. The soul is in the body, yes, but not as contained by it, like it's deep down in here, hidden someplace, but rather as containing it. The body, Thomas calls it the form of the body, the soul rather, the form of the body, includes the body, animates the body, makes the body what it is. Therefore, this dichotomization between the real me in here and the body out there doesn't work. It's just erroneous anthropology. So there's a first theme, the radicalized modern self. I think we have to stand to thwart that. Here's a second quality of critical theory and therefore of wokeism. The relativization of the truth. One of the principal marks, I think, of postmodernism and critical theory is a deep skepticism in regard to any truth claims, except their own, by the way. I mean, that's all. That argument goes back to Plato and Augustine. Whenever you take a radically skeptical position, well, what about your own theorizing? But well, hang on. I think they take a cue here from Nietzsche's perspectivalism, that we never get a grasp of the way things are, but only our limited perspective on them. So they consistently pull back the curtain on truth claims to reveal the power plays, that are actually going on. I'll come back to that. But I think the inspiration for much of this is in maybe the patron saint of critical theory, namely Jacques Derrida. His densely complex texts, famously unreadable, but they function as a kind of scripture for postmodernism. Derrida, as you know, is famous for the deconstructionist approach. Now, what does he mean? Well, he deconstructs what he calls the logocentric approach of classical philosophy, which is to say, logos, language, words, can get us in touch with reality. Think of Aquinas, the correspondence of mind to reality mediated by language. It gives us access to the way things are. Derrida deconstructs that kind of logocentrism. And he says famously in his French, Il n'y a pas de hors texte. There's nothing outside the text. I've got a text, and in classical thought, this text will get me in touch with the way things are. It'll get me in touch with the truth. But for Derrida, il n'y a pas de hors texte. There's nothing outside the text. Rather, what you have is an endless play of what he calls différence, difference. This word is not like that word, and this word relates to another one which is not like that one. And I stay permanently within the context of the text. Meaning always deferred, and hence his famous play on words. Différence, the difference of words, leads to différence, meaning deferral of meaning. I never know what things really are. It's always open-ended. Does that sound familiar? It's in the common rhetoric of even teenagers today, right? It's become the default position of most young people. There's no such thing as a real grasp of truth, but only an endless play of opinion, perspective, point of view, différence and différence, always deferring meaning. I heard Derrida at a conference once. Someone asked him, how would you define deconstruction? And he answered in his French. He said, deconstruction means, viens, oui, come, yes, yes. That sounds nice, but what does he mean? He means, look, I don't, this isn't the final answer here. This is not the truth, but there's always something new that can come, something fresh, some new way of configuring a text, some new way of thinking about it. Viens, oui. Permanent deferral of meaning and truth. That's a basic insight of Derrida. And what was once sort of whispered in the, recherché heights of the French Academy has come now to be, as I say, the default position. Who am I? What's the purpose of my life? What gender am I? Viens, oui. Come on, I'll think of it in a fresh way. Don't be tied to old perspectives. Be open, right? Here's something that, when you read the woke theorists today, the comically absurd position that even math and science, even basic mathematical statements, 2 + 2 = 4. No, that's an expression of white supremacy. That's an expression, do you think I'm joking? That's exactly what they'll say, that math and science, even in these fundamental ways, are just plays of power, because you can never say that something is true. Viens, oui, always a new perspective. Okay? Third quality of critical theory, and therefore wokeism, what I would call a fundamentally antagonistic social theory. Now, here the influence of Karl Marx. And Karl Marx is all over critical theory, and therefore, at least implicitly, all over wokeism. Marx, as you know, basing himself on Hegel's dialectical sensibility, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, the constant, ongoing development of absolute spirit, all of that. Marx takes that in, turns it on its head, makes it a dialectical materialism, and therefore reads history as the endless play, the antagonistic conflict between warring groups. He also took from Hegel, and this is very influential, it seems to me, in the present-day conversation. He took in Hegel's idea of the master-slave relationship. And when you read Hegel on that, it is fascinating. He's got wonderful insights about it. But that category of master-slave becomes a dominant category in Marx. What you have in history is a constant antagonistic play between the domineering one and those who are dominated, masters and slaves. What's the purpose of Marxist social theory, as he famously says? Philosophers have so far only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. So the purpose of Marxist philosophy is to foment a class struggle, foment the rebellion of the slaves against the masters, to bring about the communist revolution. Watch how the critical theorists and the wokeists today take this basic Marxist idea, but they extrapolate from it. So it's not restricted to the economic oppressors and oppressed, but all sorts of other forms of masters and slaves. So we talk about colonial oppression, sexual oppression, racial oppression, gender oppression, etc. But the same dynamic holds, that we have a master-slave, oppressor-oppressed binary. Speaking of binaries, again the influence of Jacques Derrida. In Derrida's analysis of language, he says that there are basic binaries within our linguistic system, and our sense of meaning often comes from how we play these binaries off one another. What does he mean? Well, male, female, straight, queer, Western, non-Western, civilized, uncivilized, white, black, etc. These binaries, Derrida says, haunt our language, and it's the way we tend to generate meaning. So he says, for example, male, straight, civilized, and white tends to rule over female, queer, non-Western, and uncivilized. It's almost like a computer language. You know, it's on or off, it's 1 or it's 0. You have these binary options within the linguistic structure. I think that's found its way very much into wokeist social theory. What we have are these binary oppositions. Much of the strategy, Marxist in form, remains the same: to speak for those who are considered on the underside of these binaries, to foment, indeed, a struggle between the binaries of oppressor and oppressed. Notice how in so much of the woke theorizing, you have to fall on one side or the other of this binary. There's no third option. There's no blending of them. You're one or the other. That's the antagonistic social theory. Fourthly, and this again is very much from Marx, the play of substructure and superstructure. I was especially struck in the summer of 2020 by this, because I heard it all the time in the rhetoric of the woke activists. Remember, in Marx's social theory, Marx is a radical reductionist, right? I mean, everything comes down to economics. It comes down to that basic economic struggle. That's the core of a society. That's the substructure. And then around it, Karl Marx said, there emerges this massively complex superstructure, whose sole purpose is to protect and defend the substructure. So for Marx, you got economics. In his case, it was the capitalist economy. And then around it is everything else in society: politics, art, entertainment, sports, religion, the military, government. All of it is simply part of the superstructural defense mechanism by which that substructure is defended. You know, like in Marx's theorizing, as you know, what's the whole point of politics? Just to defend the capitalist substructure. That's all politicians are finally interested in. What's the entire purpose of the military? To protect economic interests. That's why we go to war. And Marxists, if you read them to this day, will defend or describe every war ever fought as basically an economic struggle. How about the arts? Well, the arts are patronized by wealthy people, and the arts tend, therefore, to support and protect the wealth-generating quality of the capitalist economy. Maybe most famously for Marx, religion. So what's the point of people like me? Well, I'm a drug dealer for Marx, because religion's the opium of the masses, right? It's meant to It's meant to drug us into a kind of, insensibility so we don't realize the pain produced by the oppressive economic system we're in. Why are people like me fostered by a civil society? Because it's good for everybody that there are drug dealers around to calm people down. Religion's whole purpose, again, is to protect the economic substructure. Well, again, can you see this practically everywhere in wokeism? The conviction that, now again, choose your form of oppression, whatever your theory is, whether it's gender oppression, it's colonialism, it's slavery, that's what stands at the heart of the civil society. And everything else exists simply for the sake of protecting it. A good example of this is the 1619 Project, right? What does it all come down to? Slavery and the attempt to protect and defend the slave economy. And so that project, in a very Marxist way, reads all of society through that very particular lens. Did you notice that during the summer of 2020, these almost manic attempts to tear down the various institutions of our society? Most famously, defund the police, but there were lots of attempts, seems to me, tear down the legal structure, tear down the government, tear down the police department. Well, that's part of a Marxist form of analysis. If these things exist simply to protect a form of oppression, then we should get rid of them. Okay, I've got 8 minutes. Lastly, I think critical theory, and therefore wokeism, sees power as the supreme category. Power as the supreme category. If you're interested in the history of philosophy, this is a very intriguing proposal, because power is talked about a lot by the major philosophers. Think of someone like Thomas Aquinas. He would see God as all-powerful, yes, indeed. But he would also see God as simple. Therefore, all the divine attributes and qualities are finally one. Thus, God's power cannot be at odds with God's manner of being. Now you say, well, that's very abstract, but there's a very interesting upshot to all that. Could God, in his infinite power, make it the case that 2 + 2 = 5? Well, heck, he's infinitely powerful. I guess why not? Could God, in his infinite power, make adultery a virtue? Well, I guess. He's declared adultery to be bad, but could he declare it something good? I suppose he could, right? Thomas's answer is, well, of course not, because you're driving a wedge thereby between God's power and God's manner of being. Therefore, it's no restriction on God's power to say God can't make 2 + 2 = 5. Because 2 + 2 being equal to 4 is simply a participation in the truth that God is, right? It's no limitation on God's power to say he can't make adultery a virtue, because that would be at odds with his own manner of being. Thomas famously asks, can God sin? Well, and the objector says, well, of course God can sin. God is infinitely powerful. Heck, I can sin. So why couldn't God sin? Well, no, says Aquinas. Of course God can't sin. It would be repugnant to his manner of being. Okay, now why is this important? Because when you get past Aquinas now, into the late medieval and early modern periods, something has shifted. What emerges is a voluntaristic view, so voluntas, will, where the primacy of the will is emphasized. Indeed, God's potentia absoluta, his absolute power, is divorced from his being, so that, indeed, René Descartes can say, if God so chose, 2 + 2 could be equal to 5. The voluntaristic God has a power that can overrule, redefine reality. See, and that's a departure from what we found in Aquinas. Is it accidental, therefore, that in many of the modern philosophers, power becomes hyper-emphasized? You see it, for example, in Schopenhauer. You see it maybe most obviously in Friedrich Nietzsche. God is dead, right? Therefore, where did that potentia absoluta go? It went to me. It went to us. We now have this will to power. Don't tell me what to do. Don't tell me who I am. I can decide on the basis of my absolute freedom the nature of reality. Does that begin to sound familiar? I think coming right up out of the voluntaristic shift in late medieval, early modern philosophy to the contemporary period, the voluntaristic God has morphed into the voluntaristic, all-creating, all-defining self. You know, many in this room would remember Casey versus Planned Parenthood, right, 1992, the famous, infamous decision of the U.S. Supreme Court in an abortion case, where the justices said it belongs to the nature of liberty to determine the meaning of life and of existence. Oh, is that all I get to decide? But see, what is that? But that's, again, the transplanting of the potentia absoluta of God now into the potentia absoluta of the self. Now, along with Derrida, I would say the most influential of these critical theorists is Michel Foucault. You heard that I was a doctoral student in Paris many years ago, and I arrived in 1989 in Paris. Foucault died in 1984. And you know how Paris, there's a restaurant and a bookstore on every block, right? And as you walk around Paris in those days, looking out from the window of every bookstore was the sort of owlish visage of Michel Foucault. I mean, he was the dominant philosophical figure. What stands at the heart of his philosophy? All these claims to truth and to goodness and to value, you know, these are objectively the case, forget it. That's powerful people using language and coercion to hang on to their power. There's nothing objectively right or wrong about any of that. It's all finally about power. Listen to the wokeist theorists today. It's Michel Foucault for the masses, right? Anyone, like people in this room who would say, no, I think that's objectively true, or I think that's objectively the morally right thing to do. No. I'm just going to pull back the curtain on that to show the plays of power. The capacity for self-invention, rampant. Games of power, everywhere. That's one of the marks of wokeism. Okay? So, having just sketched those little moves, can I just say in conclusion a quick word about Catholic social teaching? Our social teaching in the Catholic Church would indeed say that each individual person is a subject of infinite dignity, but not the creator of value. See, I think everybody, that is supremely dangerous talk. When we say, along with this sort of critical theory stuff, that the sovereign self invents value, we are on a very short road to a moral chaos. Rather, we would say, at the heart of our social theory ought to be love. What's love? Thomas Aquinas said, not a feeling. Love is an act of the will. It's to will the good of the other. If that's true, then I can't love anyone unless I have a keen sense of what is objectively good. If I'm inventing value, I got my value, you got your value, and let's just vaguely tolerate each other, then we can't love each other Because love has to display itself, as it were, against the background of a hierarchy of objective value. Otherwise, I don't know what I should will for you. Catholic social theory, seems to me, stands athwart the value-generating self and stands in favor of a hierarchy of objective value, both epistemic and moral. Secondly, Catholic social teaching does not advocate antagonism as the fundamental reality in the Marxist manner. Rather, it posits a cooperative view. Individuals cooperating with one another, indeed social classes cooperating with each other, owners and workers, you want to use the old kind of Marxist terms, cooperating with each other. It stands athwart the view that we have to see society in antagonistic terms. Also, Catholic social theory stands against the Marxist substructure, superstructure reading, seeing it as hopelessly simplistic and dangerous. Dangerous because it sees everything other than the substructure as a problem that has to be unmasked or undone. Rather, Catholic social theory sees society as a very complex web of individuals and institutions subsisting in mutuality. But whenever you say, it all comes down to, now fill in the blank, you're wrong, right? Society is a complex web, and how beautiful for that very reason. Finally, it seems to me, Catholic social teaching decidedly does not hold to the primacy of power in this quasi-voluntarist way. Rather, it sees, I would say, justice and love as supreme. What's justice? Rendering to each his due. That's the classic Platonic definition. What's love? As I said, willing the good of the other. See, those are absolute values. It's a point I made in a talk I gave at Notre Dame a few months ago. The kids asked me about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I said, well, sure, those are values secundum quid, as the medievals would say. They're values, depending on circumstances. They're values as far as they go. One thing I said to them was, you think you're a radically inclusive community here at Notre Dame? And heads were nodding. I said, well, how many people were excluded from the admission process so that you could be included? That's where it's a very simple point that inclusivity, sure, it's a good thing, secundum quid, depending on circumstances and sometimes under certain circumstances. Same with the equity and inclusion. They're good secundum quid. But see, justice and love are values in se. They're valuable in themselves. And the way to test that, could you ever imagine it would be right to do something unjust? Well, no, of course not. Would it ever be right not to be loving? Well, no, of course not. Because those are absolute values. I think everybody, I'll close with this, that's the reason why we should stand against the diversity, equity, inclusion, because it's like liberté, égalité, fraternité, right? It's like the triplet that came out of the French Revolution. Those two were values secundum quid. When you try to make secondary values primary values, you lead your nation by a short route to chaos. What we ought to cling to are those values that are in se good, like justice and love. Okay, that's the end of my little sketch. I hope it gave you... Thank you. I hope it just gave you some sense of how to engage wokeism in an intellectually serious way. Mind you, they don't want to do that because they want to put it onto very emotional grounds. But I think it's very important for us to know where this system of thought came from. Listen, thank you again, everybody. Delightful to be with you tonight. Thanks.